You hear me now? Testing. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I think we'll just jump right in. Um,
דיוויד, לא שומעים אותך.
okay. How about now? Okay, we'll do it like that. It's very good that Natan started off because he's a direct lead-in into a lot of what I have to say, as you will see. My topic is actually why in the EB2 and EB3 there's so little in the way of mortuary practices and evidence for ritual activity that is connected to mortuary practices. I will also, I'll deal with two different things, the invisible aspect, but also what is visible, the outliers, and how those are significant. The first starting point for this talk is that the major EB2-3 sites throughout the country are almost universally lacking in cemeteries or tombs, with rare exceptions. And here's just a partial list that we reference. Then there are cases where there are single EB2 or EB3 tombs, and these are the unequivocal cases. Here are most of them. I think there are a couple more that have recently been published in excavations and surveys, Hadashot Archeologiot, but for the most part, these are very, very rare, and they are single tombs. All of these occur in or next to an existing early Bronze 1B tomb or cemetery. So they're never on their own almost. And they all seem to belong to the early EB2. We'll get into that a little bit more later without going into too much detail. So let's start with some examples of these single tombs, some of which are quite well known. Start with the Kinneret tomb, the very famous tomb, which is located about a kilometer away from Beit Yarach, Tel Beit Yarach, published by Amiran, Mazar, Amiran, and Haas in 1973. It's a typical shaft tomb in the bedrock of the kind that Natan described just before us. There are three phases here. The earliest phase is apparently EB1B, although Dunievsky's drawings suggest that the vessels that were found in this lowest phase actually are EB2, but we won't get into that. And then there are two other phases above that, which are EB2. Note that there is the same practice of covering the previous burial with soil, just like Natan showed us in the EB1. This is the earliest phase that Ruth Amiran identified. It is with the spouted vessel and the amphoriscos, etc. This would go with the Greenberg expedition's Tel Beit Yarach group B, EB1. And then on top, the upper groups, the upper strata of pottery belong to Tel Beit Yarach group C, where you see the typical Abydos class forms. There is metallic ware here in large quantities, etc. And of course, these interesting goodies of the kind that Natan also talked about, and here is the place to raise the emphasis on the personal and status items, as opposed to the burial kit, which is standardized. These are the things that tell us a little bit about who these people were in their lives and perhaps in their deaths. So three phases, the earliest is very minor, only 4 or 5 vessels were identified by Amiran, and the next two are much larger as far as the number of vessels. Haas could only discuss 2 minimum number of individuals and their morphologies, but this is meaningless because there was such a mess in the tomb, and it was they didn't identify the bones in a proper way, and it was also published 30 years after the excavation. So there wasn't much left. And to also lead in from what Natan talked about, the bones are cremated. And the bones are cremated before interment and then deposited in the cave. We know this because the cave and the other finds are not burnt. So they are cremated somewhere else and then brought into the tomb. which is a continuation of one early Bronze I practice. Let's now move into the Ashrat tomb that Natan mentioned also, where we start with here. The tomb is marked in green in the IAA survey website, and the Tel is right over there. So it's a cemetery of Tel Beit Emek. Here's what the tomb excavated by Smithline looked like at the time of excavation. Note that the other red spots around here also, some of them are also part of the cemetery. So it's a large cemetery. It's very disturbed. Only one individual from the EB2 was identified. It's the last burial. And it also is a continuation of the EB1B tomb that was reused in the EB2. And this is the cemetery of Beit Emek. So here is the assemblage. These are just the vessels that Smithline identified as being in primary deposition because most of the stuff was churned up and disturbed by different people over time. So you can see once again the abidosware, which is apparently this is the way that people identify and separate EB2 from EB1B. As soon as you got that and metallic ware, then you're in EB2. So that's the one aspect of the primary deposition, and this is all the EB2 stuff. So in sum, Asherat is difficult because it's so disturbed. The early EB2 is identified because of the spouted vessel in the assemblage, and once again because of the metallic ware assemblage in the tomb as well. If we move over to Gadot, the next tomb in this small group of EB2 burials, excavated by Greenberg and published in 2001, it's a similar setup. It's a shaft tomb with quite a few vessels in it. It's also an EB1 tomb that is reused in the EB2. You could say that there's continuity here. Perhaps there's the same lineage. Demographically, because here the skeletal remains were identified, it represents an entire spectrum. And this again is a multiple burial tomb. It probably is the cemetery of Tel Eteret, which is located on the Jordan River, of course. We have a very conspicuous EB1 assemblage with the crackled ware, and other typical items. We also have this fascinating Kernos ring of combined vessels of the type that you found in Byblos and at Babedra in the EB1. We won't go into that too much right now. And then you have on top the EB2 assemblage, which contains, once again, the typical jugs, abidosware, and metallic ware. If we go now to one of the En Asur tombs, Tomb 80, which was excavated by Gozelani and Sharvit about 20 years ago, we have a similar setup where the topmost tomb, the topmost burial assemblage from what's called Locus 170 is the EB2 assemblage. Everything underneath it is EB1. And this is all that was found together with that assemblage. And you can see once again, this is the criterion for dating the tomb. So those are the sites where there is unequivocal EB1 material in a single tomb, and that tomb stands alone in its context. There are a number of other tombs that are more equivocal in these 4 places, and there are a few more, in fact. I should have included Tel Afar North. These are mixed assemblages, so it's often difficult to differentiate mortuary from non-mortuary material. For example, if in the EB3 there is a storeroom made out of a tomb, then you don't always know how to differentiate the material and what the skeletal material it goes with. Also, sometimes it's difficult to distinguish between the late EB1B material from the early EB2 material. So these are equivocal cases. I bring them up because there probably is EB2 material here, but it's equivocal. Where do single EB2 tombs occur? I've marked them on the map here. And this is pretty much all of them, including the equivocal cases, with the exception of 1 or 2 more examples that are in the Hadashot Archeologia journals from the last couple of years. Greenberg points out that these individual EB2 tombs are like entire EB1 cemeteries in that they are an attempt to mark territorial attachment by EB2 settlements at a distance. These tombs are rarely right next to the site. They're sometimes a kilometer or more away. And he sees these as perhaps territorial markers. It's worth thinking about. Now let's look at the two examples of sites with EB II/III cemeteries that are rare examples. There's only two of them, of course, Jericho and Bab Edra. And let's start with Jericho from the Kenyan years. On the left is the map of the cemetery, which is to the north of the Tell. There's the Tell right there. The Jericho tombs, I've labeled them, I've color-coded them by period. There's a total of 7 EB1 or proto-urban tombs. They're all in area A and K. If you look on the map plan, you can see the blue color. Although there are only 7 tombs, Kenyan estimates there were at least 790 individuals interred in these tombs. So all of them contain tens of individuals, if not hundreds. When you go to the EB2, there are a total of 3 EB tombs in area A and just 1 in area D. 2 new tombs are carved within the EB1 cemetery. And this is a key element because everywhere else that we've talked about so far show no evidence of carved tombs. And then there's also some evidence for continued use in one of the tombs from EB1. If we move into the EB3, color-coded red, we have tombs in 3 different areas excavated by Kenyan. And here we have to remember also that when Kenyan excavated here, this was a Palestinian refugee camp. And the way that a lot of these tombs were first found was when the refugees were digging cesspits, septic tanks for their houses. And then they would report about the finding of the tomb, and then Kenyan's expedition came in and started excavating according to the information she had. So a lot of this area has not been excavated, and it probably could do with another going over. In any case, from Kenyan's results, 6 EB3 tombs were identified. 4 new tombs were excavated in area F, which is down there, fairly close to the Tell. D12 was used continuously from the EB2 to the EB3. It's a bit of a mess. And A114 actually continues all the way from the EB1 all the way through to the EB3. So you have various continuities, degrees of continuity from area to area, from tomb to tomb. Note that a lot of the tombs, where most of the tombs are located actually, are far away from the Tell, something on the order of half a kilometer or more. The EB2 tombs at Jericho are, as we said, multiple tombs. They can be very densely occupied with remains. There seems to be some element of primary burial here. It's not all secondary, although the secondary stuff is moved aside. This would suggest, of course, kin group lineages, continuing EB1 traditions. As Natan explained, there is a high degree of redundancy with the corpus, mostly bowls, jugs, juglets, amphoriscoi, and beads, which again suggests the rigid belief about the requirements of transition to death or the netherworld. In the EB3, the tombs that we have that are newly excavated there, and also the continued use of EB tombs, we also have the carving of new tombs. Continued multiple burials, again, probably continuing lineages, and again, highly redundant corpus. This time we also can add the kerachware, which is present in a couple of the tombs. Interestingly enough, one of the tombs, and it's the only one, which was first carved in EB2, is square, which is reminiscent of the outlines of the EB3 charnel houses at Bab Edra. So now we're moving to Bab Edra, which is an entity in and of itself, and it's difficult to compare it because it really is a different cultural subset. In any case, this is the site on a major terrace of the Lisan Marl, with a walled settlement and a cemetery to the east, also to the south. Here are some samplings of EB1 shaft tombs. Most of the cemetery, of course, has been plundered extensively. Here are a couple examples from that were excavated by Rast and Schaub. Nathan showed this picture before. In the late EB1, EB1B, into the EB2, we have the beginning of the round charnel houses. And here are some of the tables from Chesson's article on commemorating the dead. where we see the contents and the number of individuals. We won't go into the details right now. We don't have that much time. And following upon that, we have the rectangular charnel houses that characterize the late EB2 into the EB3. And here's an aerial photo of some of those in a drawing. Here is one of the great reconstructions that Chesson commissioned that appear in her articles. We should all be doing a lot of this because it's very evocative. And in this table, we see that when we look at the periodization, everything is EB2-3. In other words, there's a complete continuity here, and Chesson and Rast and Shab were not really able to differentiate them that much. And that again is emphasized in this chart where we look at the grave goods present in the Babedra charnel houses. Also interesting is that a lot of them have enough of data available to be able to estimate the population, the minimum number of individuals. And if we look at the vessels that go in the chart that come from the charnel houses, we're also able to estimate approximately how many vessels occur for each individual. And in this case, it follows very clearly, and this follows up on what Nathan presented, that there are usually between 3, 4, sometimes 5 vessels per individual on average. And this would reflect the burial kit. I would, however, like to point out that once again, these special objects are the things that are really interesting that point to personal status and personal preferences. And this perhaps needs a little bit more study. For example, who gets a pallet, who wears a pendant, etc. Chesson has divided the charnel houses into lesser charnel houses and greater charnel houses. And from the table, you can see that the lesser charnel houses are defined as those that have a lot less stuff in them. So now we've looked at the things that everybody has talked about, and that's fairly normative, either single tombs or the 2 examples of cemeteries. Now let's look at some of these actually more anomalous contexts at different sites, which may explain a lot about what's going on in the EB2 and EB3 burial. If we go to Tel Arad, the very famous Amiran excavated site, and we start with the EB1, there's only 1 tomb in EB1 Tel Arad, which is quite strange when you think about it. There were approximately 16 individuals in that tomb. You would expect for there to be more tombs. And this leads me to think that perhaps this tomb represents one group of people, one, let's call them ethnic identified people, who maybe are Northerners, as opposed to other people who came from the South and buried their dead in different ways, perhaps. If we move on to the EB2-3, of course, there are no cemeteries or tombs per se, but there is one skeleton located in Area K. Underneath this wall from stratum 2, in a pit underneath that, it belongs to stratum 3. It is a flexed skeleton of a 50 to 60-year-old male with no burial goods whatsoever. This is, as I pointed out already, completely anomalous. It's very unusual. There might be a couple other examples, but there's a story here with this individual. Was this, Nico Haas did not identify any pathologies. It doesn't look like there was any violence. What is this individual doing buried under the floor of a building next to the city wall? It's a mystery story. At Rosh Nikra, the publication is very sketchy, only in the Encyclopedia of Excavations by Miriam Tadmor. There's a pit located about 100 meters up the slope from the kibbutz, above the tell of Rosh Nikra, that contains great quantities of human bones and EB3 shards in a pit with no associated features. And this may be a key to part of what's going on in the EB3. This idea that perhaps there are charnel pits that are scattered in the landscape that we are just not finding. Megiddo is another part of the story. Of course, in the EB1, there is an elite cemetery here that I've written already about, which is shaded in the center plan in what's called the Eastern Slope. The Megiddo stage is so called. I've also pointed out the apsidal building complex may be a mortuary temple complex. I won't go into all the reasons now, but it's located smack inside the cemetery, and it's the only example of architecture inside an EB1 settlement anywhere in the southern Levant. So I'm suggesting that these may be sort of mortuary temples. Here's what one of those looks like up close from Elliot Brown's research into the archives in the University of Chicago. And then we have what happens in the EB2, which is almost nothing, seems to be very sketchy, if at all. And then we move into the EB3 and the palace in area BB that Matt just talked about at the beginning. During this time period, there are no tombs in the cemetery of the Eastern Slope. There's nothing. What we do have is some occupational debris, some industrial remains, and piles of bones. This is one of them. There's a smaller one and this big one, which seems to be a place where somebody collected the bones from all the tombs all around and put them into a crevice in the rock and left them there. And it may be that this is something that happened in EB3 because of the industrial remains and storage facilities that exist all around. And for other stratigraphic reasons that I won't go into right now. So these are secondary deposits of human bones that are not actually intentional burial ritualized per se. Matt also talked about the Triple Temple complex and dated it to the Intermediate Bronze Age. I would like to raise another possibility, and that is that the next slide? The ritual area of area BB, area J, is located right above the cemetery of the Intermediate Bronze Age, which is reinvigorated. And most of the tombs here date to the Intermediate Bronze Age, many, many tens of them, if not more, of different kinds, the kind that Svika Greenhoof wrote about. It was also interesting that Matt pointed out the staircase that links the cemetery with the temples. And I would like to suggest as a possibility that the temples have some kind of mortuary function as well. And now for issues that crop up when people try to date burial assemblages to the EB3. And here's one example from Karen Covello-Perran's excavations at Chorbat Zelef, which is actually a very fine excavation and very well documented, which allows one to arrive at different kinds of interpretations. So there's the site at the foot of Mount Tabor. Here is the cave. And the cave has 5 layers in it. EB1 to begin with, and then a so-called EB3 layer, and then a more substantial intermediate Bronze Age level above that. And the actual remains, this is the EB1, which is of course substantial and lots of material and lots of skeletal material. And it's quite typical in the burial kit. There we go, including a metal item. And the beads, of course. But when we get to the EB3, this is everything that's there. There are no complete vessels, it's only a few shards, and there's no skeleton per se, just some scattered burial stuff around, some scattered bones that are not articulated or anything else. And Karen has suggested, and above that, of course, is the Intermediate Bronze Age stone platform, stone pavement, and underneath that are these scanty remains. And so because below and above is a burial assemblage, which is very clear, I think that Karen attributed this to a burial without being able to really point out skeletons or skulls or anything that was specifically, that goes with the EB3 pottery. And I think that actually, this is the IBA stuff, I think that actually it's not a burial. I think that it could be a storage cave or a workshop or a shepherd shelter, or a place of ritual offerings, even to the dead, but not a tomb per se. And it definitely would be related, as Karen already wrote, to the EB3 site of Tel Kishion 3 kilometers away, which would be part of the course.
David, you have 5 more minutes.
The other case of Afula, which was excavated in the 1930s by Sukenik and published only in 1948. It's located some distance away from the Tel. We're under the water tower. This is what it looked like a few years ago. There is it's a series of pit graves from the Middle Bronze Age and Late Bronze Age next to the water tower. Here is one of the drawings of the pits showing in the upper levels MB2-3 burials. an MB1 burial with an MB1 type open bowl like you find at Megiddo. And it is on the same elevation as the Khirbet Kerachwar that apparently had bones associated with them.
David, you
The
have
problem is that the grave goods here are very fragmentary. The human remains are very fragmentary because of repeated burial and disturbance. The depths of insertion vary. The MB1 and EB3 remains are at the same depth a lot of time. And the skeletal remains, again, are not skeletons. And there's no mention of skulls. It's only scattered bones. And so we have to ask, are these really EB3 burials, or are they MB1 burial fragments that intruded down into an EB3 living context? If this cemetery represents normative burial practices, then this is the kind of thing that we have to be careful of, because this you only find in salvage excavations. When there are no monuments, when it's not an hotel, this is when you find, this is where most people were buried, in fields, in pits, and so you're not finding that much. And on the other hand, despite what I just said, if these human remains are associated with the Khirbet Kerachwar pots, and they do represent EB3 intentional practices, then this is extremely rare evidence for a normative practice in the EB2 and EB3, if, it's a big if. So I'm not going to talk about this because the people after me will talk about, but this is obviously going to be a dimension of the EB2 and EB3. Probably these features are continue to be used in the areas to the east and to the south. So conclusions. First set of conclusions speaks to the nature of the data in the Southern Levant. There are very few EB2 burials, and these represent the final breath of EB1 practices, perhaps only in the early EB2. All of the EB2 tombs are found amidst existing EB1 tombs. There are no newly established EB2 or EB3 cemeteries, period. It's also possible that there are no discernible EB3 burial assemblages at all, except Jericho and Babadra. When we look at a chart that Bradbury and Phillip put together a few years ago, this is completely, the situation statistically, minimum number of individuals buried is, in the Southern Levant is inverse to what happens in the Northern Levant. The upper curve is the Southern Levant, where you have about 20% of the possible population represented in burial assemblages, were very small numbers in the 4th millennium BC. When we merge into the 3rd millennium BC, these numbers drop precipitously, whereas in the Northern Levant, they go up. And as you can see, this continues through into the Intermediate Bronze Age, or EB4, and into the Middle Bronze Age as well. There is an inverse proportion in the different areas of how much burial is represented in these periods. And this requires more discussion. We don't have time to do it today, but there might be something going on here with populations moving, etc. The second set of conclusions involves alternative means of disposing of the dead. The dead can be buried in rock-cut tombs, continuing EB1B traditions, and this is rare. They can be buried in fields without burial goods. I would suggest this is potentially huge. This is probably most people. One other option is exposing cadavers in the landscape. How are we going to know that? It's possible. Another option is burying in the landscape with burial goods, but undetected. Salvage excavation would have encountered this, so that's not a possibility, I don't think. Cremation is another option. Comparing it to the Kinneret cremations, perhaps the EB1 cremations are just the first phase, and perhaps there's a lot more of that going on, and we're just not finding any of it. And Kinneret might represent a hybrid form of interment, both cremation and interment, perhaps. Now, the charnel houses at Babadra seem to be unique, but maybe they're not. Maybe there were a lot more of them throughout the landscape, and they're not in sites, and we're not identifying them at all, perhaps. But again, salvage would have found a few of them, you would think. Finally, differing beliefs are represented here. The EB2 and EB3 people were not a homogeneous group. There were different population groups in different regions. Natan hinted at this in his lecture. One group of people felt in the EB2 and 3, you can't take it with you. There's no point in burying objects with you. And we are all equal in death. Greenberger suggested that this represents the community of the living preferred rather than the community of death and the lineage of ancestors, which is a powerful thing. The charnel houses seem to commemorate ancestors in kin group collectives. And cremation could have two different orientations. One could reference the idea of the spirit going to the heavens with the smoke, or perhaps following John Brooks' thesis from Great Britain, that when you cremate, the body is easily broken up and then the pieces can move about in the landscape.
David, you need to
by the landscape,
finish.
make this the essence of the human being present. It's a possibility. And finally, I'd like to end up with this famous movie, Narayama, the Ballad of Narayama, which is about life in Japan in the medieval period. And it does a lot about death and a lot about birth and the relations between the two, where the ongoing motif is the old woman being brought up to the sacred mountain to die there in the cold without any burial goods whatsoever. Food for thought, and I'll leave it right there.
Thank you so much, David. And I see that there is